Welcome to the concluding session of Alliances for Art at Risk. My name is Julian McCarty. I'm joining you from my studio in Amsterdam to moderate this last session of the program, in which we will focus on future scenarios and alliances. Yesterday in the first session, when artists and organizers shared stories from Belarus and Afghanistan, I was literally close to tears. And I'm sharing this because it reminded me what makes this event so special. Namely, that it's not just about talking, but about gathering ideas and insights for the working meeting that will be organized after this event to organize action to support artists at risk. In this session, we will focus on two things: on opening the social imaginary on the resources that we have available to guide our action. And we will think through hands-on strategies for building alliances that can protect artists at risk because they live under oppressive regimes, often because they address some of the wider political, social, and environmental threats we are facing. The session has several parts. We start with a lecture by David Wengrow. This is followed by a panel discussion, a video statement from the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Claire Farrell, and an artistic intervention by Serge Hoyt. You can post questions through the session via the Artists at Risk Telegram channel or on the chat and the live stream. And at the end of the talk and the panel, we will share these questions with the speakers. So please post them there. With that, let me introduce Professor David Wengrow. Good evening, David. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening.
I will do a really short introduction and then hand over to you. David Wengrow is a professor of comparative archaeology at the University College London. And tonight, David will share some of the insights from his groundbreaking book, The Dawn of Everything, that he co-authored with David Graeber, who sadly passed away last year. In The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, they argue that conventional conceptions of history contribute to the feeling of being stuck in a world that is increasingly unequal and threatened by climate breakdown with nowhere to go, as it were. Drawing on a vast amount of historical evidence, they show that there is nothing about our current situation that is natural or inevitable. And the aim, as David put it when we talked to prepare the session, to break some of the conceptual chains that hold us back from working towards more just and less violent worlds. I can highly recommend reading the book, and it is a fantastic starting point for our conversation tonight about ideas that might help us to imagine and build institutions and alliances that can protect artists at risk, while also speaking to broader questions about how social, ecological, human, and democratic freedoms might be defended. David, I'm very glad to have you with us tonight. And with that, I hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julian. And thank you very much to Artists at Risk for the honor of giving this keynote talk. I'd like to take the opportunity in dark and complicated times to ask a simple question. Are human freedoms still possible? In the book which I wrote with the late David Graeber, who incidentally has a birthday today, he would have turned 61 years old. In The Dawn of Everything, the book that we wrote together, David and I delineate three basic human freedoms, which we argue have been common to human societies in many times and many places, and which indeed may have been typical of our species for the majority of its history on this planet. They are the freedom to move away or escape from one's surroundings, the freedom to disobey arbitrary commands, and the freedom to imagine and enact alternative forms of social existence. I must emphasize that we posit these not as purely individual freedoms, but as social freedoms, which is to say, they presuppose a certain infrastructure of mutual support and toleration and care. They are freedoms that enable, in fact, that are predicated upon the freedom of others, by contrast with the exercise of purely individual freedoms, which, without care for others, can quickly morph into micro forms of domination, sanctioned by punishment and violence. Hence, the freedom to move away is predicated on the expectation of finding hospitality and care at the point of destination. It is most clearly exemplified by the grand regional systems of hospitality created by indigenous populations in North America, Oceania, and elsewhere, and sometimes referred to in the anthropological literature as totemic systems. These were embedded in particular sacred places and landscapes, and thus highly prone to the destructive effects of European colonization and extraction. But this notion also finds counterpoints elsewhere, including in regions that I know have occupied the thoughts of this meeting. In the Pashto language of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the word Nanawate refers precisely to that duty of hospitality that is incumbent on heads of households, which obliges them to offer refuge, protection, and shelter to those who are cut loose from their families and homes. It has been argued by anthropologists that the spatial area in which similar cultural understandings of honor prevail actually has a much larger extent, reaching all the way from the valley of the Indus, all the way to the Atlas Mountains of the Maghreb, a civilizational zone, an immense patchwork of desert and sown, which fostered the great sociological insights of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. Shared aesthetic creations and systems of images, more often than not, form quite reliable traces for mapping these zones of civilization. In its emphasis on mapping the field of persecuted art practitioners today, and on facilitating their safe passage from their countries of origin, on hosting and making explicit the links between residence, art, and human rights, artists at risk might then be argued to build on a multitude of cultural traditions, including some of the deepest we know of. One of the clearest illustrations of this, which David Graeber and I came across, is the Australian concept of Wunan, sometimes translated as civilization, not in the sense of civilization as a level of cultural attainment, but rather in the sense of actually being civilized or showing civility through an understanding of moral codes and a respect of basic human freedoms. Importantly, again, Wunan is not an abstract concept, just as our three elementary freedoms are not abstract notions. They are concrete freedoms that one might actually enact. It is therefore clearly spatial, embedded in a precise and particular configuration of specific Aboriginal landscapes. In the older ethnographic literature, Wunan referred simultaneously to at least two quite different things: a system of image making, in this case, rock paintings, sometimes massive, sometimes tiny in scale, and far-flung hospitality zones traversed by people from hundreds of different communities, within which, as they moved between them, they could always expect to be valued and cared for. In the West Kimberleys, for example, Wunan is often described as a kind of ceremonial trading system, a little like the Melanesian kula. Sacred knowledge flows in one direction, material wealth in another. Yet, at the same time, it refers to the overall structure of the moiety system, which extends between groups and ensures that everyone has a partner or a potential host, even in distant places. Narinyan intellectuals have recently made a point of explaining that Wunan actually means even more than this. The Wunan system, they emphasize, is first and foremost a form of law, but a law that is impressed on the landscape through images and can only be learned by moving through it. But it is also a set of prescriptive rules of civilized behavior, the most prized possession of a Narinyan adult. Being civilized in this manner has both a moral and an aesthetic function. One senior lawman, David Mawaljalai, argued explicitly that while regional relations in the dominant white culture are founded on economics, Aboriginal civilization is built on images, and Wunan law in particular is evidence of a social order started by an artist. That is, the law is depicted through the aesthetic nature of the land. To Indigenous Australians, he says, symbolism holds as much legal validity as mathematics does for the laws of physics. Perhaps that is why these laws have more in common with each other than with Western legal codes. Mawaljalai states that the law was called the Wunan system, the law of sharing, that is, a jurisprudence of relationship and witnessing each other's behavior. A moral and legal order of such impressive scale, created by artists, seems an appropriate image for our first basic freedom, which is intimately related to the second freedom, the freedom to disobey arbitrary commands. In our book, The Dawn of Everything, we learn from early ethnographies about the nature of these connections and how they fostered advanced cultures of open political discussion and rational debate, which occasioned admiration even from Jesuit missionaries who were ideologically opposed to such freedoms and thus hardly likely to romanticize indigenous practices. We explore those connections in the crucible of New France and the 17th century colonial encounter between French missionaries, traders, soldiers, and indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region in what today is part of Canada. Encounters which, we argue, shaped emerging concepts of freedom, equality, and personal autonomy in the universalistic claims and philosophies of the Enlightenment. Jesuit observers such as Gabriel Sagard, whose 1632 work, Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, influenced both Locke and Voltaire, often marveled and wondered at the facility of native people for beautiful oratory and skilled rhetorical debate. How could such facilities have possibly come to those with no awareness of the works of Varro or Quintilian? In considering the matter, the Jesuits almost always noted the openness with which public affairs were conducted. So, Father Lejeune, superior of the Jesuits in Canada in the 1930s, says, "There are almost none of them incapable of conversing or reasoning very well, and in good terms on matters within their knowledge. The councils held almost every day in the villages on almost all matters improve their capacity for talking." Or, in the words of another friar, Lallemand, he says, "I can say in truth that as regards intelligence, they are in no wise inferior to Europeans and to those who dwell in France. I would never have believed," he says, "that without instruction, nature could have supplied a most ready and vigorous eloquence, which I have admired in many Hurons, or more clear-sightedness in public affairs, or a more discreet management in things to which they are accustomed." But it was perhaps the missionary Lejeune himself, writing in 1642, who most clearly apprehended the logical connection between reasoned debate, personal freedoms, and the refusal of arbitrary power. "They imagine," he wrote of the Montagnais Nescapi, "that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild ass colts, rendering no homage to anyone whatsoever, except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times, because we fear our captains, while they laugh at and make sport of theirs. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful only insofar as he is eloquent. And even if he kills himself, talking and haranguing," says Lejeune, "he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages." Jesuits then clearly recognized and acknowledged an intrinsic relation between refusal of arbitrary power, open and inclusive public debate, and a taste for reasoned argument. It was largely the speakers of Iroquoian languages, such as the Wendat or the Haudenosaunee nations to their south, who appear to have placed such weight on reasoned debate, even finding it a form of pleasurable entertainment in its own right. This fact alone, we argue in the book, had major historical repercussions, because it appears to have been exactly this form of debate, rational, skeptical, empirical, conversational in tone, which before long came to be identified with the European Enlightenment as well. And, just like the Jesuits, Enlightenment thinkers and democratic revolutionaries saw it as intrinsically connected with the rejection of arbitrary authority, particularly that which had long been assumed by the clergy. Indigenous historians and ethnographers, from Francis Laflèche to Willard Rawlings, have noted how, in the history of the American Midwest, migration is often framed as implying the restructuring of an entire social order, merging our three elementary freedoms into a single project of emancipation, to move away, to disobey, and to build new social worlds. For example, the Osage, a Siouan people who appear originally to have inhabited the region of Fort Ancient in the Middle Ohio River, before abandoning it for the Great Plains, used the expression moving to a new country as a synonym for constitutional change. What would we now call social movements, or rather what we would now call social movements, often took the form, quite literally, of physical movements through a landscape. How best to enshrine such projects in international law and institutions today? I trust, or at least I very much hope, that there are others at this meeting and elsewhere who are much better qualified than I am to answer that question. No doubt there are formal correspondences with human rights law, but in practice, we might do best to focus on institutions which are able to perceive a crisis of migration as what it truly is, a crisis of hospitality, and to respond to it as such. If we're seeking a conceptual counterpart to the three freedoms, not in European traditions of law, but in European philosophy, the closest I am myself aware of is to be found in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, specifically in the three metamorphoses which open the discourses of Zarathustra upon his going down the mountain. They are the metamorphoses of the spirit as it becomes in turn a camel, a lion, and a child. The camel, you'll recall, is the load-bearing spirit which takes upon itself heavy things and hastens into the wilderness, where it undergoes the second metamorphosis into a lion. Freedom will it capture, writes Nietzsche, and lordship in its own wilderness. There the spirit encounters the great dragon with golden scales, whose name is Thou shalt, but to whom the spirit in lion form replies, I will. But neither the power of the lion nor of the camel can match the ultimate claim of the great dragon, which is that all created values are in my body of gold, and all values have already been created. To create new values, says Nietzsche, that even the lion cannot yet accomplish. But to create itself freedom for new creating, that the might of the lion can do, only by turning itself into a child. The final metamorphosis. For what can the child do that neither the lion nor the camel can achieve? It can make a new beginning and start again the game of creating. Here I find a beautiful mnemonic for the three freedoms we set out in our book, The Dawn of Everything. Let's recall also that the power of Nietzsche's great dragon, its gift of arbitrary command, lies not just in the blinding glare of its golden scales, unmarked by time, but also in their great antiquity. All values have already been created, and all created values do I represent. The values of 1,000 years glitter on these scales. The Dawn of Everything is a project of reclaiming time, and so also reclaiming space for other values, drawing on the latest evidence of my field, archaeology, and on the complementary insights of David Graeber's field, anthropology. To make sense of this flood of new evidence from around the world, we suggest it is necessary to remove the conceptual blinkers that keep our gaze fixed on a common and pervasive myth. For generations, our remote ancestors have been cast as primitive, either free and equal innocence or thuggish and warlike. Civilization, we are told, could only be achieved by sacrificing those original freedoms, or alternatively, by taming our baser instincts. We show how such theories first emerged in the 18th century as a conservative counter-reaction to powerful critiques of European societies posed precisely by those indigenous observers and intellectuals who understood at least something of what it means in practice to live in societies based on concrete human freedoms, where one is not trained into obedience from the cradle to the grave. We try to show how history becomes a far more interesting place once we learn to throw off our conceptual shackles and perceive what's really there. If humans, as we show, did not spend 95% of their evolutionary past in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers, what were we doing all of that time? If agriculture and cities did not mean a plunge into hierarchy and domination, then what kinds of social and economic organization did they lead to? What was really happening in those periods of history we usually describe as the origins of the state? All of these questions can now be answered, at least partially, on the basis of evidence, not just mere speculation. Millennia of human experience reclaimed from the dragon of time, revealing that the course of human history may be less set in stone and more full of playful, hopeful possibilities than we tend to assume. We find that thousands of years before what we usually call the birth of democracy, there were already well-organized cities on most of the world's continents that didn't have kings or queens or even bureaucracy. Cities that were organized largely from the bottom up on the basis of neighborhood councils and local assemblies. We find that thousands of years before the coming of agriculture, our species was already experimenting with a truly wild variety of social possibilities. In Europe of the last ice age, we find kings and queens whose authority came and went with the changing seasons. In the Americas, we find vast public arenas where hunter-gatherer publics assembled in their thousands. We find slavery already adopted, but also abolished by people who had never once in their histories practiced agriculture. In light of the modern evidence of archaeology and anthropology, those chains of causality that were supposed to lead from humanity's prehistoric adoption of agriculture to the rise of private property, accumulation, and competition, and thence to cities, taxes, exploited labor surpluses, extractive elites, and permanent underclasses across the whole of the known world, those chains of causality we find are no longer made of iron. They are not even made of straw, but instead, I would say, of highly elastic rubber bands stretched now to the point of snapping across eons of time. Time that dogged, boring adherents of just so stories tell us we must ignore, discount as so many blind alleys or lag times. They tell us that the only histories are the histories of those who behaved as they ought to, which is to say, who followed the familiar plot of history. Only those histories count. Only they are able to set in motion chains of causality which do not lead to dead ends, they tell us. All of which seems rather blind to the possibility, even the likelihood, that our species is now set on a course to imminent disaster, the ultimate dead end, which will make losers of us all. The dawn of everything is a new history of humanity, partly because it is the history of those who didn't do as they ought to. And as it turns out, there were lots more of them in history than we've been led to believe. The cat is out of the bag. A reviewer of the book, Rachel Kiddy of the University of Oxford, wrote in the British journal Antiquity, and I quote, "As an ethnographic archaeologist working with contemporary displaced people who are often forced to survive in the diminishing cracks of global capitalism, I am wholly convinced by the author's argument that humans have the capacity, if not today the legal right, to reflect on the consequences of a particular direction that could be taken and to choose a different path. Given their relative freedom of movement and freedom to disobey," she says, "compared with people today, isn't it entirely plausible that those in the deep past developed, abandoned, resisted, and reconfigured societies until there was nowhere left to go? Nowhere left to go." Is this an argument for or against the thesis of our book? Surely, the skeptical historian might remark, the fact that there is almost nowhere left to go is itself proof enough that under modern technological and demographic political conditions, there is simply nowhere left to go. But far from being a more scientific view of history, this latter perspective seems dangerously close to a moral argument that victory is destiny, or even that might is right. To say we have nothing to learn from the experience of those who were defeated, lied to, stolen from, blighted by pandemics, and dispossessed by force is to ignore the fact that with each passing decade, those processes move further and further out of the colonial periphery and into the demographic heart of humanity. With each passing year, more and more of those people on the losing side of history are none other than us, ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We now have time for a few questions. Thank you very much for this talk and for, I think, introducing the audience to this idea to revisit history really as an archive of possibility. You evoked this image of the cat being out of the bag. So I guess in the rest of the session, we're going to ask where we're going to take that cat to play. And I have a couple of things where I think I would like to ask you to go a little bit deeper. So I really love this idea of how circulating images and systems of hospitality matched onto each other. Because in a way that is, you could say, quite close to what Artists at Risk are working towards. So not just getting artists out, but also creating a network of artistic peer support and production, having also these two systems kind of operating in parallel. And I just wondered if there's any insights or learnings from how the system was organized that you think we might be able to translate to a contemporary, version.
Well, I think it makes more sense under current conditions to look to more recent precedents, such as Albert Hirschman's work in the Second World War, which led to his concept of exit, where, he was part of this evacuation effort, which prioritized and included intellectuals and artists like Marc Chagall. I think in a purely practical and logistical sense, this is important, but I think what the examples I'm talking about illustrate is that the definition of art and the way that art is either commoditized, valued, or sucked into systems which are the opposite of hospitality systems is important, because using images as a basis for those kind of communitarian systems is not just at odds with modern nation states and immigration laws. It's also, I think, quite at odds with the art establishment itself and the nature of the values that are inculcated in art and define what an artist actually is. So I think the challenge is really to see the connection in the first place, and then the potential of the relationship between these two things. I can't see how it could work if you just change one without the other.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I think that these three interrelated freedoms are useful for the session again, because, then getting artists out is not just a rescue mission, but it's actually a wider argument that free circulation of artists should be part of, global art production. So I think that's really a good point to take forward.
I think you could make that argument, yes.
That's at least how I heard you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was also wondering, kind of following on that, in the previous sessions, we learned that many of the most effective initiatives to protect artists at risk actually develop from kind of friendship and peer networks, including our host, Artists at Risk. So they're based on, you could say, relationships of mutual care. And you make a really interesting point in the book that you only touched upon briefly now, saying that, historically, in modernism, we have a kind of conflation of care and violence. And I would love you to say a bit more about that so that we can take that on board when we think about, what kind of networks you could build and what role care can play.
That's right. One of the arguments in the book, after we've explored and effectively tried to negate many of the standard assumptions about where structural inequality really comes from. So after we've argued that it's not an inevitable or logical consequence of adopting agriculture or living in large, dense concentrations of people, what are we left with as an explanation for the roots of social inequalities? And the pattern which emerges in the book, as you say, and which definitely requires further exemplification and exploration, but it is a pattern that we noticed, is that inequalities become entrenched and violence becomes entrenched precisely when it becomes entangled with what we call systems of care. So, for example, the evidence of warfare and interpersonal violence in deep human history doesn't really have a pattern. It's quite sporadic, and it doesn't always lead to a major transformation of human societies. But when it becomes linked to systems of care, ideas about the proper way to get married or treat the dead, basic human concerns, something else seems to happen, which does become structural. And we can see it both at the very small scale of families and households, but also at the scale of kingdoms and empires. Ancient Egypt is a very obvious example of a violently unequal and expansionist society, which devoted much of its economy to the creation of great monuments of care. That's what all those pyramid temples basically are. They're an enormous machine for caring for the dead, or a very small number of the dead. And yes, this emerged as a pattern, not just in time, but also in space, because the systems of violence are I would say, parasitical on the systems of care. So we show, for example, how these great temple systems emerged as regional systems in the Middle East, whereas monarchy and aristocracy begin on a very small scale. But once they latch themselves onto the larger networks, then you have a situation which is roughly corresponding to empire, or what most people would describe as the emergence of states. So yes, we think this is fundamental. We don't pretend to fully understand it. We think it needs more exploration. I think it is also relevant to art institutions and museums because, of course, as I've pointed out before, a museum is the perfect instantiation of the transformation of violence into care. I'm talking about big state museums, colonial collections, where what is appropriated is brought in and lovingly conserved and cared for, is a perfect physical example in architectural space of the transformation of violence into care and how ephemeral acts of violence and domination can be turned into structural inequalities.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from the chat. So there's a question about this idea of being stuck. Reading, since we have nowhere to go, literally, the planet is finite and disobedience creates conflict, even war. Where can we build our new space for social freedom? Yes, we can free ourselves from our self-imposed ignorance, but how can we resist our oppressors without leaving? So I guess the question is about the conditions, for leaving.
Well, I mean, clearly, we all have very different scope. And I think the point that Kiddy was making in her review, and which I believe you've seen examples of in this meeting, is that even people who are confined, literally confined, physically and mentally to the most appalling, limited circumstances, still very often find ways to assert their freedoms. Those of us who are much more privileged and much more free to act, I think have many different ways. I mean, I'm just recently actually in discussion with a number of people about looking at spaces which do claim to be spaces of social freedom. Museums and art galleries, for example. We still have a situation here in London where our major metropolitan archaeological museum accept sponsorship from fossil fuel companies, which is precisely the kind of coming together of two things, which we argue can have far-reaching, fairly calamitous consequences. So, I think there may be smaller and larger things that all of us can do depending on our circumstances. It's not really possible to generalize.
I think that's fair enough. So I have another question that asks about David Graeber's concept of prefigurative forms that might prepare us for the post-oppressive state.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is whether you agree with it, or I guess how it aligns with the argument you presented tonight.
Well, my understanding of it, which is not a practical understanding in the way that David insisted it must be, is the idea of acting as if you're already free, which I don't only agree with it, I love it as an idea and as a way of living. I think it requires certain sacrifices, or at least it's very difficult to do. I think if you're tied in to structures of debt and family obligations or relations of care, I've listened to not just David, but others who have been far more involved in movements like the global justice movement than I have personally. What I hear is a lot of careful thinking about how one might extend these temporary, what are sometimes called zones of autonomy, spaces of freedom, which are becoming increasingly difficult and dwindling in countries that ostensibly claim to have great freedoms. How to turn those from ephemeral moments of assembly into more durable structures. And I think this touches on a really key question, maybe a central theme of the book we wrote together, because the message of our standard narrative about history is really that only relations of violence and domination are capable of scaling up. So what we try to do in the book is rescue from history and from the evidence of our fields many examples of the opposite happening, of relations that are not based on that scaling up, relations based on mutual care, mutual aid, and mutual assistance, voluntary and voluntaristic relations, relations based on consensus. And we see that actually these are surprisingly common throughout history. So, as you said earlier, Julian, I think history itself, or a more accurate understanding of human history, can itself become a resource, a kind of archive for thinking about the possibilities of prefigurative politics as well.
I guess that opens, invites us to take less literal the idea of nowhere to go and look at conceptual realms to go also to open then actual places going from there, the way I understand you. Which brings us to another question by Colin. It's just Colin in the chat, who's asking how an artist whose three freedoms to move, to disobey, and to imagine other kinds of orders and to be creative, how would an artist make that possible while he's suffering, under oppressive regimes like Russia, Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, or Burma? And what's the role of art and cultural institutions to make this dream come true? I'm not sure this is an entirely fair question to ask you, but if you have somewhere to take it, I would love to hear it.
I think it is a question for your organization, for Artists at Risk. I don't think it's a question for me, or at least I think it would be pretentious on my part to claim to have anything even approaching the beginnings of an answer or a solution. But I like to think, or at least the fact that you've invited me here today, if the work that I've done together with David or elsewhere can be of any use or of any inspiration, I'll be very happy.
Thank you. I mean, it certainly is. I think we have time for one last question. And I was just wondering whether you could just briefly reiterate, how you see these three different freedoms interrelate. I know you talked about it, but I would love having it like in a nutshell again.
Well, a simple example that we give in the book, is to think of the negation of the three freedoms. So a natural thing for, let's say, a woman in an abusive relationship to do is move away. If you take away the freedom to move away, you lose the freedom to disobey. And of course, to create something different. And in the book, we go a little bit into how processes like that may have multiplied on a grand scale in ancient Mesopotamia, in the prehistoric Middle East. So it's important because it shows how changes on the small scale, the intimate scale of gender relations, relations between the old and the young, domestic servitude, are the beginnings of all this. They're not the products. And it also suggests that it may be on that very small, intimate scale of human relations that we can begin to reclaim some of this ground, which has clearly been lost.
Which I think is a really interesting point to take forward, also just in terms of the scale at which we think about intervening. David, I know that you have to go, so I would like to thank you for your time and for sharing your work. I think this is a really great start to the session, and because it speaks to both kind of conceptually stuck and where we might go and where there is places to go in a conceptual reservoir, as well as how that relates to the actual movement of people who are at risk and being oppressed. So thank you for sharing your work with us, and I wish you a good evening.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.